Snow lashed like frozen needles beneath a bruised Montana sky. Eliza Thorne ran, her wedding gown a tattered ghost against the howling blizzard. Hoofbeats pounded behind her. Swallowed by the wind scream, closer, always closer. Panic clawed her throat raw. She stumbled, the icy crust biting through silk. Something small and silver, a locket shaped like a dove, tore free, vanishing into the white oblivion. Hands, brutal and gloved, seized her. A coarse rope bit into her wrists. She was dragged, struggling futilely, toward a looming silhouette in the storm, a solitary pine, stark and unforgiving near a cabin's hulking shadow. They lashed her fast to the gnarled trunk, the bark scraping her cheek. A crumpled paper was thrust into her frozen hand. Then, the riders melted into the storm's fury, leaving only the wind's mournful dirge and the crushing silence of the wilderness. She closed her eyes, a silent scream trapped within. Who would find her? Who had left her to die, bound like an offering to a forgotten god of solitude? And why here, beneath the shadow of a lonely lumberjack's home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. The axe bit deep into the seasoned oak, the thwack echoing sharply in the crystalline air. Amos Kane paused, his breath pluming thickly in the late afternoon chill. Winter was tightening its grip on the bitter roots earlier than usual. He wiped sweat from his brow with a faded bandana, the rough cotton scratchy against skin weathered like old saddle leather. 9 winters. 9 long, silent winters since the mind collapse buried his laughter, his future, his very reason for breathing beneath tons of unforgiving rock. Iron Creek, with its pitying stares and whispers that followed him like ghosts, became unbearable. He'd retreated here, to this high, lonesome valley cradled by granite peaks, where the only sounds were the wind in the pines, the crackle of his own fire, and the rhythmic song of his axe. His cabin, a single room built from logs he'd felled and notched himself, crouched against a sheer rock face. Smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney, the only sign of life for miles. Snow already dusted the clearing, frosting the stacked firewood, the chopping block, and the rugged peaks that clawed at the heavy, leaden sky. The wind hissed through the frost-crusted pines, a sound Amos knew intimately, sometimes a lullaby, sometimes a lament. Today, it felt restless, edged with something sharp in the cold. He hefted the axe again, the familiar weight a grounding force against the emptiness that perpetually yawned within him. Splitting what wasn't just chore, it was rhythm, purpose, a way to keep the ghosts at bay for a few more hours. He was lining up another log when the wind shifted. It carried a sound, not its usual mournful sigh, but something thin, desperate. A whimper, or just the wind playing tricks on weary ears. Amos straightened, his gaze scanning the tree line where the path wound down toward the distant, barely visible smudge of Iron Creek. Nothing moved but the swaying branches. He shook his head, chiding himself. Solitude bred phantoms. He raised the axe. There was again, undeniable this time, a choked, guttural sound, ripped away by the gust but clinging to the air like frost. Not an animal. Human. Fear, cold and unfamiliar after years of numb routine, prickled along his spine. He dropped the axe handle onto the chopping block, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. His hand instinctively went to the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker holster at his hip, its weight a familiar, grim comfort. He moved toward the sound, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen crust of snow, every sense straining. He found her 20 paces beyond the edge of his clearing, near the ancient sentinel pine that marked the boundary of his self-imposed exile. She was slumped against a massive trunk, bound tightly with coarse rope that bit cruelly into the thin silk of a once white wedding gown, now stained with mud and torn at the hem. Her dark hair, partially freed from its elaborate pins, fell across her face, matted with snow and tears that had frozen on her cheeks. She wasn't struggling anymore, her eyes wide and dark as a winter midnight, stared past him, unseeing, lost in a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen her very breath. One small, bare hand was clenched into a fist, knuckles white against the faded silk in her lap. Amos froze. The sight punched through the thick shell of his solitude, leaving him momentarily breathless. A bride? Here? Tied to his tree? It made no sense. It was an obscenity against the harsh, simple logic of his mountain world. He scanned the surrounding woods, his hunter's eyes raking the snow-dusted undergrowth, the dark avenues between the pines. No movement, no sound but the wind and the frantic hammering of his own heart. Whoever had done this was gone. He approached slowly, cautiously, his movements deliberate, trying not to startle the wild creature fear had made her. "Easy now," he rumbled, his voice rough from disuse, sounding alien even to his own ears. "Easy. I ain't gonna hurt you." He kept his hands visible, open, palms forward. She flinched violently at the sound, a tremor racking her slight frame, but her gaze remained fixed on some unseen horror. Her silence was absolute, profound. Not a sob, not a whimper escaped her now. It was the silence of a rabbit caught in a snare, waiting for the end. Amos knelt beside her, the snow soaking through his worn trousers. He saw the raw abrasions on her wrists where the rope had chafed, the unnatural pallor beneath the dirt on her face. Fury, cold and hard, tightened in his chest. This was an accident. This was deliberate. Cruel. He drew his skinning knife from its sheath on his belt. The blade gleamed dully in the fading light. Her eyes flickered towards it, widening further with pure terror. She shrank back against the rough bark, a silent plea screaming from every tense line of her body. "Shoo!" Amos murmured, keeping his voice low, soothing like he might speak to a spook horse. "Just cutting you loose. That's all. Nothing more." He worked carefully, the sharp blade slicing through the thick rope with ease. He sawed gently, mindful of her raw skin. As the last strands parted, she crumpled forward boneless, like a puppet with its strings cut. Amos caught her before she hit the snow, her slight weight negligible in his arms. She was freezing, trembling uncontrollably. Her clenched fist loosened slightly as he lifted her. A small, crumpled piece of paper, stained with snowmelt and what looked like a smear of blood, fluttered to the ground. Amos saw the words scrawled hastily in dark ink. For Amos Kane. Ice colder than the Montana winter seized his heart. For him? What madness was this? Who knew he was here, buried in this forgotten valley? Who would deliver a broken bride to his doorstep? The name struck him like a physical blow. It had been years since anyone had addressed him directly, purposefully. The isolation he wore like a second skin suddenly felt thin, violated. He tucked the note into his pocket, a cold dread settling in his gut alongside the bewildered fury, cradling her against his chest. Amos turned back toward the cabin. She was utterly limp, her head lolling against his shoulder, her breath shallow and rapid. Her wedding gown, absurdly delicate against the rough weave of his flannel shirt, felt like a shroud. He kicked open a heavy plank door and carried her inside, kicking it shut behind him against the encroaching storm and the terrifying questions that now swirled in the wind. The cabin's warmth enveloped them, thick with the scent of wood smoke, cured leather, and the lingering tang of the venison stew simmering in the cast-iron pot hanging over the hearth. Firelight danced on the rough-hewn log walls, glinting off the few simple possessions. A sturdy table he'd built, a single chair, a narrow cot pile with thick wool blankets, shelves holding tins and tools, a worn saddle in the corner. It was a place of stark utility, a fortress against the world. Now, it felt invaded by this fragile, terrifying mystery. He laid her gently on his own cot, the only soft surface. She curled instinctively into a tight ball, her face buried in the rough wool blanket, her shoulders shaking with silent tremors. Amos stood back, feeling clumsy, enormous, out of place in his own sanctuary. What did one do with a half-frozen, traumatized bride delivered by unseen hands? He moved to the hearth, his movements automatic. He stirred the stew, more for something to do than necessity. He filled a battered tin cup with water from a bucket and set it near her on a small crate he used as a bedside table. He added another split log to the fire, the flames leaping higher, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance with unease. He watched her. The firelight caught the delicate curve of her cheek, the dark sweep of her lashes against skin that was slowly regaining a hint of color, though it remained chalky beneath the grime. The absurdity of the wedding gown, torn and soiled, was a jarring counterpoint to the rugged simplicity of the cabin. Who was she? What nightmare had she fled? And why tie her to his tree? Why address her to him? The note in his pocket felt like a burning coal. Memories, long buried beneath layers of grief and hard labor, surged unbidden. The frantic dig at the mine entrance after the rumble ceased, the suffocating dust, the terrible, echoing silence that followed the last desperate shout. Finding them, Sarah, little Ben, crushed beneath the fallen timbers. The raw, gaping wound of that loss had driven him here, to this solitude. He'd sought oblivion, a place where the past couldn't find him. And now this, a broken woman delivered like a macabre parcel. Was it punishment? A cruel joke? Some sick reminder of the life ripped away? Guilt, his oldest companion, twisted deep within him, had his withdrawal from the world made him a target for someone's twisted scheme? He approached the cot again, slowly. He picked up one of the thick wool blankets folded at its foot. Deep blue, woven by Sarah's hands in another lifetime, its edges worn but still sturdy. He hesitated, then draped it gently over her trembling form, covering the ridiculous, heartbreaking silk of the wedding gown. He tucked it loosely around her shoulders, avoiding any touch that might startle her. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, ever so slowly, almost imperceptibly, she pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Her knuckles, where they gripped the wool, were still white, but it was a conscious movement, a tiny, fragile gesture of acceptance, of seeking warmth, of something other than utter terror. Amos let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a flicker of something akin to relief, fragile as a firelight, warmed him momentarily. He sank into the solitary chair by the hearth, the weight of the day, the shock, the resurfaced grief, settling heavily upon him. He stared into the flames, seeing not the dancing light, but the frantic run to the blizzard, the brutal hands, the crude rope, the stark words on the note. For Amos Kane. Who? Why? He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the crumpled paper. He hadn't looked at it properly, only glimpsed those damning words. He needed to see. He pulled it out, smoothing it against his thigh in the firelight. The scrawl was hasty, jagged, done with urgency or malice. For Amos Kane, and below that, squeezed into the corner as an afterthought, two more words that turned his blood to ice. She knows. The fire crackled. The wind moaned around the eaves. The girl on the cot, Eliza Thorne, finally slept, exhaustion claiming her. But Amos Kane sat rigid in his chair, the cryptic note trembling in his hand, staring into flames as if they held answers. She knows. Knows what? The dread solidified into a cold, hard knot in his chest. This wasn't random. This was a message, a threat, and the fragile woman shivering under Sarah's blanket wasn't just a victim. She was a key to a darkness Amos thought he'd left buried in the mines of Iron Creek. The silence of the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was a quiet before a storm he hadn't seen coming. He had brought her inside, offered warmth, shelter. But outside, the blizzard raged, and the wilderness felt suddenly watchful, hostile. What or who had she seen? And who was coming back to ensure she never spoke? The firelight flickered, casting long, menacing shadows on the wall. His axe leaned against the doorframe, ready. His hand rested once more on the worn grip of the Colt. 9 years of solitude had just ended. The reckoning, it seemed, had only just begun. The word she knows burned in Amos's mind like a brand pressed onto cold flesh. He stared at the crumpled note, the firelight making the jagged script dance like malevolent spirits on the page. The girl, Eliza Thorne, he'd learned from the embroidered tag inside her ruined gown's bodice, slept fitfully on his cot, wrapped in Sarah's blue blanket, her face a pale moon against the dark wool. Each shallow, shuddering breath she took was a counterpoint to the storm's fury outside and the deeper tempest raging within Amos. Knows what? The question hammered against his skull with the insistence of a woodpecker. What secret was buried in this fragile woman's silence that warranted such cruelty? And why deliver her to him? To a man who'd spent 9 years trying to forget the world, and the world trying to forget him? The note felt like a key to a door he'd welded shut long ago, a door behind which lay only pain. He glanced at the axe leaning by the door, the Colt on the table. They were tools for survival in the wilderness, blunt instruments. This felt like a different kind of fight, fought in shadows he couldn't see. Dawn bled reluctantly into the cabin's single window, a gray smear against the thick glass. The blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving behind a world muffled and glittering under a thick mantle of snow. The silence outside was profound, broken only by the occasional heavy thump of snow sliding from overloaded pine boughs. Inside, the air hung thick with unspoken dread and the scent of wood smoke and reheated venison stew. Eliza stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, instantly wide and alert, filled with the same raw terror Amos had first seen. She recoiled against the log wall, pulling the blue blanket tight around her chin, her gaze darting wildly around the unfamiliar space before locking onto him. He sat at the table, deliberately still, his hands visible on the scar beside a tin mug of weak coffee. "Mornin'," he offered, his voice low and gravelly. He kept his movements slow, predictable, like approaching a skittish deer. He gestured towards a steaming mug near her on the crate. "Water. Coffee's here if you want it. Got stew warm and—" She didn't reach for it. Her eyes, dark pools of anguish, held his, searching. For what? Malice? Deceit? Or a lifeline? Her gaze flickered down to her own hands, still raw from her ropes. Then, slowly, deliberately, she raised one trembling finger and pointed toward the pocket of his flannel shirt where the note resided. Amos's gut tightened. He hesitated, then pulled the crumpled paper out. He didn't unfold it, just held it up so she could see its edge. "This!" A violent tremor shook her. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, her eyes pleading now, filled with a desperate urgency that transcended words. "Who did this to you, girl?" Amos asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who left you out there?" Her mouth open, a soundless gasp escaping. Her throat worked, muscles straining, but no sound emerged, only a faint, choked wheeze. Frustration and despair contorted her features. She slammed her fist weakly against the ruffled blanket, tears welling and spilling silently down her cheeks. The sight tore at Amos, a visceral reminder of helplessness he knew too well. He remembered Ben, small and feverish, crying weakly in Sarah's arms, the doctor miles away in Iron Creek, useless herbs steaming on the stove, the crushing weight of being unable to fix it, to take away the hurt. "Easy," Amos murmured, pushing the memory down. He rose slowly, fetching a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper he used for tallying logs from a shelf. He placed them carefully on the crate beside her untouched mug. "Can't talk? Maybe you can write it. A name, a place, something." She stared at the pencil as if it were a venomous snake. Her hand hovered over it, trembling violently. The effort seemed monumental, the act of forming words an impossible mountain. She looked at him again, her eyes filled with profound, aching sorrow that went beyond her immediate terror. It was the look of someone who had lost everything, twice over. He saw it then, peeking from the torn neckline of her gown, caught on a frayed thread, a delicate silver chain. Instinctively, Amos reached out, his callous fingers surprisingly gentle as he freed the small object tangled there. It was a locket cold against the skin, shaped like a dove with wings slightly spread. He held it up, the firelight catching the intricate feather detailing. "This yours." Eliza's breath hitched. She snatched the locket from his hand with startling speed, clutching it to her chest as if it were her last anchor to sanity. Her knuckles whitened around the tiny silver bird. She nodded again, fiercely this time, fresh tears tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. The locket wasn't just jewelry. It was a talisman, a fragment of a life ripped away. The morning wore on in a fragile, watchful truce. Amos tended the fire, checked the perimeter of the cabin through the frosted window, seeing nothing but the pristine, deceptive snowscape. He forced himself to eat some stew, pushing a bowl toward Eliza. After a long hesitation, hunger overcoming fear, she took small, wary spoonfuls, her eyes never leaving him. The simple act felt like a victory, a crack in the wall of her trauma. He spoke little, his words sparse and practical. "Gotta see to the wood." Winds died down. More stew. He avoided looking directly at her for too long. Sensing it unnerved her. He spoke of the mountains, the names of the peaks visible on clear days, the habits of deer that sometimes ventured near the clearing, neutral things, grounding them both in a tangible world beyond the cabin's tense confines. He mentioned Iron Creek only once, obliquely, when explaining where he got his coffee beans. A flicker of something, recognition, fear, crossed her face before she quickly looked down. Around midday, a crunching sound approached the cabin. Amos was instantly on his feet, the Colt in his hand before he consciously thought to draw it. Eliza shrank back on the cot, pulling the blanket over her head, her body rigid with terror. "Amos Kane, you buried alive in there or just hibernated with the bears," a familiar, gravelly voice called out, followed by a wet, phlegmy cough. Relief, mixed with irritation, washed over Amos. He recognized the voice of Jedediah Cobb, an old trapper who sometimes roamed these high valleys. Jed was harmless, mostly deaf, and famously oblivious to social cues. The last person Amos wanted near his fragile charge, but perhaps a source of unvarnished news. He cracked the door open, keeping his body blocking the view inside. Jed stood in the snow, a grizzled apparition bundled in mismatched furs, his long gray beard crusted with ice crystals. He leaned on a gnarled walking stick, a string of scrawny pine martens draped over his shoulder. His rheumy eyes squinted up at Amos. "Heard the storm wailing like a banshee last night. Thought I'd see if you got blowed clean off the mountain. Brought you a marten pelt. Prime fur." He held up one of the frozen carcasses. "Morning, Jed," Amos said, keeping his voice level. "Storm's past. I'm still here. Appreciate the thought, but I'm set for pelts." He kept the door mostly closed, hoping the old man would take the hint. Jed peered past him, his curiosity piqued. "Smells like something other than burnt beans in there for once. You finally learned to cook, Kane?" He took a shuffling step closer. Amos shifted, firmly blocking the doorway. "Just stew. Nothing special." He needed Jed gone. "You hear any news down Iron Creek way?" "Been a spell since I've been down." Jed spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the snow. "News? Nah. Same old dung heap. Old man Henderson lost another cow to wolves. Preachers at the lung fever, spitting blood like a stuck pig." He scratched his beard. "Silas Rourke's back, though. Rode in 2 days ago, looking like he swallowed a hornet's nest. Whole town's walking on eggshells around that one." The name struck Amos like a physical blow. Silas Rourke, the owner of the Prosperity Mine, the man whose relentless push for deeper shafts, ignoring the miners' warnings about shaky timbers, had led directly to the collapse that buried Sarah and Ben. Amos hadn't seen Rourke since the funerals, where the man had offered hollow condolences and a pittance of compensation before vanishing back east. Guilt, hot and corrosive, flooded Amos. Rourke's greed had taken his family, and Amos had simply walked away, buried himself in the mountains with his grief. "Rourke," Amos managed, his voice tight. "What's that snake doing back?" Jed shrugged, already losing interest. "Dunno." Talk as he's sniffing around the old silver load claim up near Dead Man's Gulch. Thinks there's more silver the first crew missed. Or maybe he just likes stirring the pot. Man's got a mean streak wider in the Missouri. He coughed again, a deep, rattling sound. Well, if you ain't dead and ain't wanting pelts, I'll be moving on. Cold seeping into my bones. He turned, his furs rustling, and began trudging back the way he'd come, leaving deep, solitary tracks in the virgin snow. Amos closed the door slowly, leaning his forehead against the rough wood. Silas Rourke, back in Iron Creek. Coincidence? Amos Kane didn't believe in coincidences. Not anymore. The note the girl delivered to his door. She knows what about Silas Rourke? What had this broken bride witnessed? The pieces clicked into a horrifying, plausible picture. Rourke, ruthless and vindictive, silencing someone who threatened his interests, and delivering her to Amos. Was it a twisted taunt? A reminder of his power, his ability to destroy lives? Or something darker, a way to tie up loose ends by implicating the town's known recluse? He turned back to the cot. Eliza had lowered the blanket slightly. She'd heard. Her eyes were fixed on him, wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. She'd recognized Rourke's name. She knew exactly who Jed was talking about. Amos walked towards her, the way of the past and the peril of the present pressing down on him. He stopped a few feet away, meeting her terrified gaze. That man, Silas Rourke, he's the one, he asked, his voice rough with suppressed rage and a terrible certainty. Eliza didn't nod. She didn't need to. The sheer, unadulterated fear that flooded her eyes was answer enough. It was a look Amos remembered seeing only once before, on Sarah's face in the split second before the timbers gave way. He sank to his knees beside the cot, not in supplication, but in grim resolve. He looked at her, this stranger delivered into his desolate world, clinging to a silver dove in a silence born of unspeakable horror. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and fierce, cutting to the cabin's heavy air. "I failed people before, people I loved. I won't fail you. Whatever you know, whatever he did, you ain't alone with it anymore. You hear me? You're safe here." The words felt heavy, almost foreign on his tongue. A vow he hadn't made in 9 years. A vow that meant stepping back into the world he'd fled. Eliza stared at him, the terror in her eyes momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of something else. Disbelief? A fragile, desperate hope? Her hand, still clutching the dove locket, trembled violently. Then, with agonizing slowness, she reached for the pencil and scrap of paper on the crate. Her movements were stiff, painful. She hunched over, shielding the paper with her body, the pencil scratching faintly. Amos watched, his heart pounding against his ribs. The fire crackled. Outside, a branch groaned under its burden of snow. Time stretched then. Finally, she stopped. She didn't look at him. With trembling fingers, she pushed the scrap of paper towards him, then curled back into herself, pulling Sarah's blanket over her head like a shield against the world. Amos picked up the paper. 2 words were scrawled there, shaky and uneven, but unmistakable. He saw. The implication hit Amos like a bucket of ice water. He saw Eliza, saw what she knew, saw her escape. It changed everything. It meant Rourke or his men knew she was alive, knew where she might have gone. Delivering her to Amos wasn't just a message or a taunt. It might have been a temporary measure, a way to contain her until a distant sound pierced the muffled silence outside. Not the wind, not a falling branch. A sharp, rhythmic crack, crack, crack. The unmistakable, brittle report of multiple gunshots echoing up from the valley far below, towards a trail that led to Iron Creek. Amos was on his feet instantly, the Colt back in his hand. He moved to the window, peering through the thick, imperfect glass. The snow-laden landscape was still deceptively peaceful, but the gunshots hung in the cold air like smoke. Warning shots? A struggle? Or something more deliberate? He looked back at the cot, at the small, blanket-covered mound that was Eliza Thorne, and then at the scrap of paper in his hand. He saw, and now, someone was shooting down near the only trail to his hidden valley. Coincidence had just died its second death. The fragile peace of the cabin shattered. The reckoning wasn't just coming. It was already here, echoing up the mountain. Amos tightened his grip on the Colt, his gaze fixed on the tree line where the trail emerged. The snow-covered clearing wasn't sanctuary anymore. It was the killing ground, and he was standing right in the middle of it. Whoever had fired those shots was on their way. The only question was, how many and how soon? The silence that followed the distant gunfire was deeper, heavier, filled with the terrible weight of approaching violence. He had vowed to protect her. Now, the wilderness itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if a broken man and a silent bride could survive the storm of men. The gunshots' echoes died, leaving a silence thicker than the snow blanketing the bitterroots. Amos remained frozen at the window, every nerve taut as a bowstring. The Colt's grip was cold iron in his hand. He saw Eliza's scrawled words pulse in his mind alongside the phantom cracks from valley. Saw what? Her escape, her knowledge, and now, gunfire on the trail to his sanctuary. Coincidence was a luxury buried with Sarah and Ben. He scanned the tree line where the path emerged, a dark wound in the pristine white expanse. Nothing moved but the wind, sighing through laden branches and sending fine plumes of snow swirling like ghosts. Yet the air vibrated with unseen menace. Those shots were a declaration, a boundary crossed. Whoever fired them was coming. A muffled whimper drew his attention. Eliza had burrowed deeper beneath Sarah's blue blanket, only the top of her dark hair visible, a small, terrified island in the cot. The sight pierced his resolve. 9 years he'd spent hardening himself against the world, building walls of solitude and routine. Now, within a day, those walls lay in splinters, and this trembling woman, bound and delivered like a cursed parcel, was his responsibility. I won't fail you. The vow, spoken in the heat of realization, felt heavy now, weighted with the ghosts of his past failure. He remembered Sarah's hand, small and strong in his, the day they moved into their first shack in Iron Creek. We build our own shelter, Amos, she'd said, her eyes bright with shared dreams. He'd built walls against the world, but not against the mind's greed, not against the crushing timbers. He hadn't been able to shelter them then. He had to shelter Eliza now. Stay down, Amos rasped, his voice rough but steady. And stay quiet. He moved with grim efficiency, the habits of self-reliance overriding the cold dread coiling in his gut. The heavy plank door received an extra crossbar he'd fashioned years ago for imagined wolves. He dragged the solid oak table, scarred by countless meals eaten alone, and braced it against the doorframe. The cabin's single window, small and set high, was already a poor vantage point. Now it became a potential weakness. He covered it with a thick woolen horse blanket, plunging the room into a murky twilight lit only by the hearth's restless fire. The axe he placed within easy reach beside the door barricade, the Colt tucked into his belt. Every scrape of wood, every thud, echoed loudly in the tense silence. He was turning his refuge into a fortress, a trap, or a tomb. Eliza watched him from her cocoon, her eyes wide and dark in the dimness, tracking his movements. Fear radiated from her, a palpable chill in the already cold air. Yet, as he secured their prison, a flicker of something else surfaced, a desperate comprehension. She understood the preparations. She knew what the gunshots meant. Her hand emerged from the blanket, still clutching the silver dove locket. She stared at it, her thumb tracing the delicate wings, her expression a battleground of terror and dawning resolve. Amos finished his grim work and leaned against the braced table, breathing heavily. The firelight flickered across his face, etching lines of exhaustion and remembered grief. The oppressive quiet stretched, broken only by the fire's crackle and the relentless whisper of the wind outside. It was a silence filled with waiting, with the imagined crunch of boots on snow, the click of a rifle hammer. Eliza stirred, Slowly, deliberately, she pushed the blue blanket down to her waist. She sat up, her movement stiff and pained, but her gaze held his with startling intensity. She pointed to the stub of pencil and the scrap of paper still lying on the crate beside the cot. Then, with her other hand, she held up the dove locket, her eyes pleading. Amos understood. He fetched the pencil and paper, placing them on the cot beside her. He watched, his own breath held, as her trembling fingers worked the tiny clasp on the locket. It sprang open with a soft snick. Inside, nestled against worn velvet, weren't portraits, but two things: a single perfect white feather, impossibly soft and downy, and a tightly folded, minuscule square of paper, thinner than onion skin. Her hands shook so violently she fumbled. The feather fluttered to the blanket. Amos bent and picked it up, its delicate perfection a stark contrast to the cabin's harsh reality. He handed it back. She took it, clutching it fiercely, then carefully extracted the tiny folded paper. With agonizing slowness, she unfolded it. It was a clipping from a newspaper, the print so small Amos had to squint. The headline was partially torn, but the words were unmistakable. Rourke declares silver load played out. Miners displaced. Eliza pointed a trembling finger at the name Rourke, then tapped the scrap of paper on the cot. She needed to write, her brow furrowed in concentration, the pencil clumsy in her injured hand. The silence deepened, thick with anticipation. Amos watched the shapes form. Silver load. She paused, then added, not empty. Her hand hovered, trembling. Then, with a surge of effort, she scrawled two more words. He stole. He stole. The word slammed into Amos. The silver load. The mine Jedediah mentioned Rourke was sniffing around. The mine where Amos's family died. Declared played out. Miners cast aside into hardship, but not empty? And Rourke stole the silver? The implications unfolded like a poisonous flower. Fraud on a massive scale. Miners cheated. Lives ruined. And if Eliza knew, if she had proof, Amos remembered the whispers after the collapse. The suspicions about shoddy timbers, Rourke cutting corners for profit. But this was colder, crueler. Deliberate theft disguised as misfortune. You saw, Amos whispered, the words scraping his throat. You saw the silver? Proof. Eliza nodded, a sharp, jerky movement. Tears welled again, but these were different. Tears of rage mixed with terror. She pointed to the locket, then to the tiny clipping, and made a tearing motion. She'd stolen the evidence. That's what she knew. That's why she'd been silenced. She'd been part of Rourke's world, close enough to discover his secret, close enough to marry who? The wedding gown, the locket. Had she been betrayed by her own groom? Delivered to Amos as a message in a death sentence? The wind outside rose, moaning around the eaves like a restless spirit. Then another sound, faint but distinct, the crunch of snow, not the wind shifting a branch. A deliberate, heavy step, then another, approaching from the direction of the sentinel pine. Amos's blood turned to ice. He raised a finger to his lips, his eyes locking with Eliza's. She froze, her breath catching audibly. He moved silently, like a shadow, to the edge of the covered window, using the tip of his skinning knife. He lifted a tiny corner of the horse blanket, just enough to peer out into the blinding whiteness. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, maybe 40 yards out, partially obscured by the thick trunk of a ponderosa pine. Not Jed Cobb. This man was taller, broader, swathed in a heavy, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He stood unervingly still, scanning the cabin, the barricaded door, the covered window. A rifle was cradled casually in his arms. Even at this distance, Amos could sense the coiled menace, the professional assessment of a hunter surveying prey. This wasn't a lost traveler. This was a man sent to find, or to finish. Amos let the blanket fall back. He turned, his face grim. Eliza was watching him, her eyes huge pools of terror in the gloom. The scrap of paper which he stole lay beside her, a damning testament. The feather was clutched in her white-knuckled fist. The locket lay open on the blanket, the tiny clipping exposed. Proof. Death warrant. He crossed the small space in 2 strides, crouching beside the cot. The air between them crackled with shared peril. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid wall against the fear threatening to engulf her. "That man out there," Amos said, his voice low, intense, cutting through the thudding of his own heart. "He's Rourke's. Come for what you took. Come for you." He met her terrified gaze, the firelight reflecting in his own eyes, hard as flint. "But he's got to go through me first. You understand? Through me." It was an oath, sealed in the shadow of his past failure. He wouldn't let the mountain take another innocent life. Not while he drew breath. Eliza stared at him, the terror momentarily eclipsed by a profound, desperate gratitude. Her free hand, the one not clutching the feather, moved slowly, tentatively. It hovered for a heartbeat, then settled lightly, trembling, on his forearm where it rested on the cot's edge. The touch was brief, featherlight itself, but it carried the weight of a world. It was trust, hard-won and fragile, offered in the face of annihilation. A heavy fist pounded on the cabin door. 3 thunderous blows that shook the crossbar and sent dust sifting from the rafters. The sound was a gunshot in confined space. "Amos Kane," a rough voice bellowed from outside, harsh and devoid of warmth. "Open up. Got business with you." The voice paused, then added, laced with cruel amusement. "And with the little bird you found, we know she's in there. Rourke wants his property back." Eliza snatched her hand back, recoiling into the blanket, a choked whimper escaping her. Amos was on his feet instantly, the Colt drawn and leveled at the door, his body positioned between the threat and the cot. His mind raced. One man? Or were there others, flanking the cabin? The window? The pounding came again, more insistent. "Don't make this hard, Kane," the voice shouted. "Just hand her over. She ain't worth dying for. Open this door or we burn you out." There were more. Amos's gaze darted to the covered window, then back to the door. The firelight flickered wildly, casting monstrous, leaping shadows on the walls. He saw Eliza shrink further, her eyes wide with primal terror, the white feather trembling in her grasp. He saw the tiny, damning newspaper clipping lying exposed on the blue blanket. He stole. The evidence Rourke would kill to silence. The man outside shifted. Amos heard the distinct, metallic snick of a rifle being levered, a shell chambered. The sound was obscenely loud. The voice turned hard, final. "Last chance, Kane. Open up, or we start shooting through these walls." The fragile truce was over. The waiting was done. Outside stood death, sent by Silas Rourke. Inside huddled the proof of his monstrous crime, and the broken woman who carried it. Amos tightened his grip on the Colt, his knuckles white. He met Eliza's terrified eyes across the small, firelit space. He gave a single, sharp nod, a promise, a defiance. The cabin walls felt paper-thin, the barricades suddenly flimsy. The next sound wouldn't be a demand. It would be the roar of a gun, the splintering of wood. Amos braced himself against the table, the Colt steady, aiming at the point where the first bullet would tear through. The wind howled outside, a mournful counterpoint to the deadly silence within. He had seconds, only seconds, to fight, to die, or to find a miracle in the heart of the frozen wilderness. The firelight danced on the barrel of the gun, a final, defiant glimmer in the gathering dark. The reckoning wasn't echoing up the trail anymore. It was pounding on the door, and Amos Kane, the lonely lumberjack, stood ready to meet it, a silent bride his only witness, and a stolen secret their only shield. The air crackled, thick with gunpowder and doom. Outside, the rifleman drew a breath. The cabin walls shuddered under the rifleman's pounding, each blow a hammer strike against Amos Kane's resolve. The firelight wavered, casting jagged shadows that danced like specters across the log walls. Eliza Thorne curled tighter on the cot, her breath a shallow, panicked rasp, the white feather trembling in her fist. The newspaper clipping he stole lay exposed on Sarah's blue blanket, a fragile indictment of Silas Rourke's greed. Amos stood between the door and Eliza, the Colt Peacemaker steady in his hand, its barrel aimed at the splintering wood. The voice outside, cold as a Montana frost, demanded her call her Rourke's property. Amos's jaw tightened. Property. The word burned, a bitter echo of the mind's collapse, when Rourke had treated lives as expendable. He hadn't saved Sarah or Ben. He wouldn't fail Eliza. Stay low, he hissed, his voice a low growl, barely audible over the wind's mournful howl. Eliza's eyes, wide with terror, met his. She nodded, a jerky motion, and slid to the floor, clutching the locket and feather, her body pressed against the cot's rough frame. The pounding ceased, replaced by a heavy, deliberate crunch of boots in the snow. More than one pair. Amos's pulse thundered. The rifleman wasn't alone. He edged toward the covered window, lifting the horse blanket's corner with his knife. The fading daylight revealed two figures now, the tall rifleman joined by a shorter man, wiry and hunched, both swathed in dark coats. The second man carried a torch, its flame licking greedily at the cold air, casting an orange glow on the snow. They stood near the sentinel pine, conferring in low murmurs, their breath pluming like smoke. The rifleman gestured toward the cabin, his movements sharp, predatory. The torchbearer nodded, circling toward the back, where the log wall met the rock face. Amos's gut twisted. They meant their threat. Burn them out. A memory surged, unbidden, sharp as a blade. The mind's collapse, the choking dust. Sarah's scream cut short as timber splintered. Ben's small hand, still warm, slipping from his grasp. Amos had clawed through rubble until his fingers bled, shouting their names into a silence that answered only with death. He blinked hard, shoving the past down. Not now. Not her. He turned to Eliza, her eyes locked on him, reflecting the fire's defiant glow. They ain't taking you, he said, the words of vow carved in stone. Not while I'm standing. Eliza's trembling hand tightened on the feather. She pointed to the clipping, then made a frantic gesture, tearing, hiding. She'd stolen proof of Rourke's fraud, a secret worth killing for. Amos nodded, understanding. She wasn't just a witness. She was a threat to Rourke's empire. But who was she to him? The wedding gown, the locket. Had she been promised to someone in Rourke's circle, betrayed when she uncovered the truth? The air shifted, heavy with the acrid scent of smoke. Not wood smoke from the hearth. Something sharper, chemical. Amos's heart lurched. Kerosene. He lunged to the window, peering through the blanket slit. The torchbearer was dousing the cabin's rear wall, the liquid glinting in the torchlight as it soaked the logs. The rifleman stood watch, his weapon raised, scanning the clearing. They were methodical, practiced, hired killers, not drifters. Rourke's men. Amos acted on instinct. He grabbed the axe from beside the door, its weight a familiar anchor. Eliza, Flory barked. She obeyed, flattening herself against the cold planks. The blanket pulled over her head. He crossed the back wall in 3 strides, listening. A faint crackle, fire catching. The logs were thick green, but kerosene burned hot. Time was short. He pried a loose board near the floor, one he'd meant to fix years ago, revealing a narrow gap where the cabin met the rock face. Cold air rushed in, carrying the stench of burning pitch. He thrust the axe through, swinging blindly at the unseen torchbearer. A startled yelp, a clatter. The torch hit the snow, hissing as it died. Amos pulled back, heart pounding. He'd bought moments, not safety. A gunshot roared, splintering the door's crossbar, which shards rained down. Eliza stifled a cry, her hands over her ears. The rifleman's voice cut through the chaos. Last warning, Kane, give her up, or we drag you both out in pieces. Amos didn't answer. He shoved the table harder against the door, its legs groaning. Another shot, this one through the wall, punching a fist-sized hole inches from his shoulder. Dust and splinters stung his face. He dropped to one knee, firing twice at the hole. The Colt's recoil sharp in his palm. A grunt outside, a heavy thud. Someone hit the snow. The rifleman cursed, his voice retreating slightly. One down, maybe, but the kerosene stench lingered, a promise of fire to come. Eliza crawled toward him, her movements jerky but determined. She clutched a pencil and a fresh scrap of paper, her eyes fierce despite the terror. She scribbled, her hand shaking but resolute, and thrust the paper at him. Amos took it, squinting in the dimness. 3 words, scrawled in desperate haste. I was his. His. Rourke's? Amos's mind reeled. The wedding gown, the locket, the clipping. It clicked into place. Eliza had been close to Rourke, perhaps betrothed to him or his kin, close enough to see his ledgers, his lies about the silver load, close enough to steal proof. And when she did, he'd silenced her, dressed her as a bride to mock her betrayal, and left her for Amos to find, a taunt to the man who'd once dared question his greed. Amos's blood boiled. Rourke hadn't just stolen silver. He'd stolen lives, futures, trust. You were his, Amos repeated, his voice low, raw with rage, and you took what had ruined him. He met her gaze, seeing not just fear but defiance, a spark that hadn't been there before. You're braver than he'll ever know. Eliza's lips trembled, a silent sob breaking free. She reached out, her fingers brushing his callous hand, a fleeting touch that carried a weight beyond words. Trust, hard-earned, sealed in the firelit gloom. Amos gripped her hand briefly, a silent promise, then released it. They weren't safe yet. A new sound, hooves, distant but approaching, heavy and deliberate through the snow. Reinforcements? Amos's jaw clenched. He moved to the window, peering out. The rifleman had retreated to the tree-lean, cradling his arm. Amos's shot had grazed him, but the torchbearer was gone, his tracks leading toward the trail. The hoofbeats grew louder, a low rumble like thunder under the snow. Amos counted 3, maybe 4 horses. Rourke wasn't taking chances. Eliza tugged at his sleeve, pointing to the loose board at the back. Her eyes were wide, urgent. Escape. Amos hesitated. The cabin was a fortress, but a death trap if they stayed. The kerosene-soaked logs could reignite with one spark. He nodded, grabbing the axe and a rusted lantern from a shelf. He handed Eliza the lantern, its faint glow a fragile beacon. Stay close, he whispered. We move fast. He pried the board wider, the gap just enough for them to slip through. Cold air bit his face as he crawled out, Eliza behind him, her gown catching on the rough wood. The rock face loomed above, a sheer wall offering no escape, but the snow-covered ground led to a narrow ravine, a deer trail Amos knew well. He helped Eliza through, her breath pluming in the icy air. The lantern's light flickered, casting long shadows on the snow. They moved silently, the ravine's steep walls shielding them from view. The hoofbeats were closer now, accompanied by shouts, Rourke's men regrouping. Amos's mind raced. The trail led to a frozen creek, a mile from Iron Creek. If they could reach town, find the sheriff, maybe, but Rourke owned half of Iron Creek. Trust was a gamble. A twig snapped behind them. Amos spun, coat raised. A figure emerged from the shadows. A boy, no older than 16, bundled in a patched coat, his face pale under a tattered hat. Mr. Kane? He whispered, voice cracking. Jed Cobb sent me. Said you're in trouble. Said Rourke's men are hunting a woman. Amos lowered the gun slightly, eyes narrowing. Who are you, kid? Tom Haskell, stable boy in Iron Creek. He glanced at Eliza, then back. Jed heard talk, Rourke's paying bounty hunters. They say the woman knows something about the silver load. Something big. Sheriff won't help. He's Rourke's man. Amos's grip tightened. The sheriff bought. No sanctuary in town. But Tom's presence, sent by Jed, was a flicker of hope. You alone? Amos asked. Tom nodded. Got a horse at yonder. Can get you to Widow Creek's cabin. She's no friend of Rourke's. Eliza clutched Amos's arm, her eyes searching his. He saw her fear, but also resolve. She nodded, urging him to trust the boy. Amos hesitated, then lowered the colt. Lead on, Tom. But you double-cross us, you'll regret it. They followed Tom into the ravine, the hoofbeats now dangerously close. The lantern flickered out, plunging them into near darkness. Amos kept Eliza close, her hand gripping his sleeve. The clipping, the feather, the locket, proof of Rourke's crime, were with him a dangerous burden. But as they moved, a new sound cut to the wind, a low, guttural shout from the cabin's direction. The attackers had breached the door. Amos froze, his heart hammering. They'd found the empty cot. The clipping was gone. Eliza was gone. And Rourke's men would know exactly where to hunt next. But something else chilled him deeper. Tom had whispered a name, Widow Creek, a recluse, a woman who'd lost her own to Rourke's greed years ago. She'd help. But her cabin lay across Dead Man's Gulch, a narrow pass Rourke's men knew well. They were walking into a trap, and Amos had no choice but to lead them there. The snow fell harder, cloaking the world in white, but it couldn't hide the hoofbeats closing in. The reckoning wasn't just at the door anymore. It was riding straight for them, and the secret in Eliza's locket was about to light a fuse that could burn down Iron Creek itself. The snow fell in heavy sheets, cloaking the Bitterroot Mountains in a shroud of white that muffled all but the relentless thud of hoofbeats. Amos Kane led Eliza Thorne and young Tom Haskell through the narrow ravine, their breaths pluming in the frigid air like fleeting ghosts. The silver dove locket, its damning clipping tucked inside, hung heavy against Eliza's chest, a fragile shield against the storm of Silas Rourke's wrath. Dead Man's Gulch loomed ahead, a jagged scar in the mountains where Widow Creek's cabin offered their only hope of sanctuary. But Amos's gut churned. The breached cabin, the rifleman's threats, the hoofbeats closing in. It was a trap, and they were walking into its jaws. His Colt Peacemaker, cold and heavy in his belt, was a grim reminder. Hope was a luxury he'd buried 9 years ago with Sarah and Ben. The ravine opened into a frozen clearing, the gulch's walls rising like sentinels on either side. Widow Creek's cabin, a squat log structure half buried in snow, crouched against a granite outcrop. A thin thread of smoke curled from its chimney, a beacon in the twilight gloom. Tom pointed, his young face taut with urgency. There, Mr. Kane. She's home. She'll hide you. Amos hesitated, his hunter's eyes scanning the tree-line. The hoofbeats had stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence that pressed against his ears. Eliza gripped his sleeve, her fingers trembling but firm, the white feather still clutched in her other hand. Her eyes, dark pools of resolve, urged him forward. I was his, she'd written, Rourke's betrothed, a witness to his fraud, abandoned to die as a message to Amos, the man who'd once dared question Rourke's greed. The clipping he stole was proof enough to ruin him, and Rourke's men were closing in to ensure it never saw Iron Creek's light. Move, Amos whispered, guiding Eliza toward the cabin. Tom scampered ahead, his patched coat blending with the snow. The air was thick with the scent of pine and impending violence. Amos kept Eliza close, her torn wedding gown a stark contrast of wilderness, her silence a weight heavier than the colt. Every step felt like a countdown. They reached the cabin's door, a weathered slab of pine. Tom knocked, a sharp, desperate rhythm. Widow Creek, it's Tom Haskell. Open up. The door creaked open, revealing a gaunt woman in her 50s. Her gray hair pulled tight, her eyes sharp as flint. A shotgun rested in her hands, its barrel steady. Who's this? She demanded, her voice rough as gravel. Amos Kane, he said, meeting her gaze. And her. Rourke's men are hunting us. Jed Cobb said you'd help. Her eyes narrowed, flicking to Eliza, then back to Amos. Rourke, she spat, the name venomous. Took my husband in that damn mine collapse. If you're crossing him, You're welcome here." She stepped aside, ushering them in. The cabin was sparse, warmed by a low fire in a blackened hearth. A patch quilt hung on one wall. A rusted kettle steamed on a table. Widow Creek barred the door, her shotgun never lowering. "Talk fast," she said. "What's Rourke want with her?" Eliza, trembling but resolute, opened the locket and handed the clipping to Widow Creek. The older woman squinted at the tiny print. Rourke declares silver load played out, then at Eliza's scrawled note. He stole. Her face hardened. Silver load. My man died for that lie. Rourke bled it dry, hid the silver, and left us starving. She saw it. Amos said, his voice low. Ledgers, maybe. Proof he cheated the miners. Cheated Iron Creek. He glanced at Eliza, who nodded, her hand tightening on the feather. A memory surged, Sarah's voice, soft and fierce, promising to stand by him when he'd rage against Rourke's negligence. He'd failed her. He wouldn't fail Eliza. Widow Creek's eyes blazed. Proof like that had burned Rourke's empire to ash. No wonder he wants her dead. She moved to a shelf, pulling down a small lockbox. Got something of my own. Letters for my husband. Before the collapse, said Rourke was fudging the yields, keeping silver off the books. She unlocked the box, revealing brittle papers. Never had the means to prove it, until now. Before Amos could respond, a sharp crack split the air, a rifle shot, close, shattering the cabin's stillness. Eliza flinched, dropping to the floor. Amos drew the Colt, crouching beside her. Widow Creek swung her shotgun toward the door. Tom, wide-eyed, scrambled a window, peering through a crack in the shutters. 3 men, he whispered, Rourke's bounty hunters. Got torches again. The air grew heavy with kerosene's bite. Amos's heart pounded. The trap had sprung. He met Eliza's gaze, her fear mirrored his own, but there was something new, defiance, a spark that matched the firelight. She pointed to the locket, then to Widow Creek's letters, and made a pushing gesture. Take them. Fight. Amos nodded, his resolve hardening like iron. Widow, you gotta back way out. She jerked her head toward a trapdoor under a woven rug. Root cellar. Leads to a gully. Ain't much, but it's cover. She handed Amos the letters, her grip fierce. Get to Iron Creek. Find Preacher Daniels. He's honest. Hates Rourke. Show him the proof. Another shot splintered the doorframe. Spraying wood. Shouts outside, harsh urgent. Kane, you're boxed in. Hand over the girl, or we torch this place. The rifleman's voice, now joined by others, carried a cruel confidence. Amos lifted the trapdoor, revealing a damp, earthen tunnel. He helped Eliza down, her gown catching on the rough edges. Tom followed, clutching the lantern. Widow Creek stood firm, shotgun ready. I'll hold him, she said. Go. No, Amos growled. You ain't dying for us. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the trapdoor. A crash shook the cabin, the front door buckling under a heavy blow. Firelight flared outside, casting an orange glow through the shutters. Kerosene flames licked the walls. They scrambled into the cellar, the air cold and musty. Amos led, Colt raised, Eliza's hand gripping his sleeve. The tunnel was narrow, roots snagging their clothes. Above, Widow Creek's shotgun roared, answered by a scream and a volley of gunfire. Amos's heart clenched. She bought them time, but at what cost? The gully opened into a snow-choked pass, the walls of Dead Man's Gulch looming overhead. The hoofbeats were back, closer, cutting through the storm. Amos pushed Eliza and Tom behind a boulder, scanning the darkness. 3 riders emerged, their torches casting flickering shadows. The lead rider, the rifleman from the cabin, bore a bloodied arm, Amos's earlier shot. His face was hard, scarred, a man who killed for coin. Spread out, the rifleman barked. They're close. Find the girl. Amos whispered to Eliza, stay with Tom. Get to the preacher. He pressed Widow Creek's letters into her hand. the clipping already in her locket. Her eyes, wide with protest, locked on his. She shook her head, clutching the feather, a silent plea. "I ain't leaving you," Amos said, his voice fierce. "But this ends now." He stood, Colt raised, stepping into the open. "Hey!" he shouted, drawing the rider's eyes. "You want her? Come through me." The rifleman sneered, leveling his weapon. Amos fired first, the Colt's roar echoing off the gulch. The rifleman slumped, his horse rearing. The other two riders charged, torches blazing. Amos dug behind the boulder, bullets kicking up snow. Eliza grabbed the lantern, smashing it against the ground. Oil flared, a brief wall of flame slowing the riders. Tom yanked Amos's arm. "This way." They ran, Eliza stumbling but resolute, the feather and locket clutched tight. The gully narrowed, leading to Iron Creek's outskirts. The riders' shouts faded, but hoofbeats persisted. One still pursued. Amos's lungs burned, his mind flashing to Ben, small and laughing, running through a meadow. He'd failed then. Not now. They reached Iron Creek's edge, the preacher's small church glowing faintly. Amos pounded on the door. Preacher Daniels, a frail man with kind eyes, opened it, startled. "Amos Kane? What?" "No time," Amos panted, pushing Eliza and Tom inside. He handed Daniels the letters and locket. "Rourke steel and silver. She's got proof. His men are coming. Get this to the judge." Daniels nodded, clutching the evidence. "Hide in the cellar. I'll fetch the deputy, the honest one." He bolted the door. Eliza grabbed Amos's hand, her touch fierce, grounding. She pointed to her heart, then his, a silent vow. Together, Amos nodded, his throat tight. 9 years of solitude, shattered by a silent bride and a fight he couldn't walk away from. Hoofbeats thundered outside. A single rider, the last of Rourke's men. A torch arced through the air, crashing against the church's wall. Flames caught, greedy and swift. Amos drew the Colt, his eyes on Eliza. The proof was safe. The preacher would deliver it. Rourke's empire would fall. But the fire was spreading, and the rider's shadow loomed. Amos tightened his grip, ready to face the final reckoning. Eliza stood beside him, feather in hand, her silence louder than any scream. The church burned, a beacon in the snow, and Iron Creek would never be the same.